This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 243 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So over the last couple of weeks, and really, I guess you could say over the last forever, you've heard me talk about the importance of draft capital. How draft capital, or the picks spent on a player, should be factored into how we view these players. Mecole Hardman comes to mind. Before the draft started, Hardman wasn't even in my top 10 fantasy wide receivers. Post-draft, he's my wide receiver too. A lot of that has to do with landing spot, but it also has to do with draft capital. But simply saying you should invest in players who have strong draft capital isn't enough. There's no proof in those words. So today, I'm going to talk through some of that proof. I'm going to provide evidence and data that explains the importance of draft capital at running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Before digging in, I wanted to let you guys know that FanDuel is running another Tiger Woods-related promotion. You may not know this, but at the Masters, FanDuel ran a promotion where if Tiger Woods won, you would get your entry fee back if you were in the Big Cat Eagle contest. And users got their wish as FanDuel refunded $1 million in entry fees. Well, it went so well that they're running it back for the PGA Championship. If you enter the Big Cat Eagle contest or the Big Cat Stinger, and if Tiger Woods wins, you'll get your entry fee back. That's $15 per entry for the Eagle and $3 for the Stinger. To enter, go to FanDuel.com and check out the PGA lobby. So there are a lot of angles to go at when communicating some of this data with draft capital. The easiest way to start, or the way that I think is easiest, is to sort of run through the profiles of top finishers in fantasy football. In other words, what does the top 6 running backs or high-end RB1s looked like over the last decade? What sort of draft capital has been associated with those players? So let's start there. Over the last 10 years, we've had 60 high-end RB1 seasons because I'm looking at top 6 as high-end RB1, so it's 6 times 10, 60. Of those seasons, we've got some duplicates. There have been players who have finished in the top 6 multiple times. Now, when removing those duplicates, we get 33 unique players. And this is all PPR related, by the way. Among those 33 unique players, these are 33 running backs who ranked in the top 6 over the last 10 years. Only 2 of them were undrafted players during the NFL draft. Those 2 were Arian Foster and Danny Woodhead. The only other player who was drafted lower than 130th was Peyton Hillis. He was the Cisco of running backs. He had just 1 hit and then he fell off the map. And meanwhile, the only triple-digit overall picks, so picks 100 or later, that made this list having at least one high-end RB1 season, those players include Devontae Freeman, James Conner, and Darren Sproles. So outside of Hillis, Foster, and Woodhead, those are the only 3 players who were drafted outside the top 100. So guys, we're really looking at a scenario where the vast majority of high-end RB1 seasons are coming from players who were selected in basically the first 3 rounds of drafts. Over the last 10 years, of the 33 players who have had 1 or more high-end RB1 season, 27 of them were drafted 97th or higher. That's a rate of about 82%. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't draft players who are outside the top 100. It's not like you can just monopolize all the RB1s in fantasy football. What it does mean, though, is that if you're shooting for ceiling, you have information in front of you that can really help you increase the chances of getting a true impact player at running back. You just get a guy who has good draft capital associated with him, or top 3 round draft capital. Now, if we extend this to all RB1s or top 12 running backs, we get 61 unique running backs. That's up from 33. So 61 players have finished as top 12 running backs at least once over the last 10 years. This group has a few more players without top draft capital. Of the 61, 6 of them went undrafted, and 21 of them were either undrafted or they were picked after pick 100. So to put this another way, 34.4% of running backs who have finished with at least one top 12 season over the last decade were basically drafted after the 3rd round, or not drafted at all. With regards to top 6 seasons, that number was just 18%. Maybe that 34% figure seems high to you. 1/3 of RB1 seasons are coming from players who are basically afterthoughts. But think of it this way. Over the last 15 drafts, and we'll include 2019's draft here, but over the last 15 drafts, a total of 109 running backs have been drafted in the top 100. There have been 218 running backs drafted after that pick. And there have been loads and loads of undrafted players who made teams as well. So again, 21 of the 61 unique RB1s over the last decade have come after pick 100 or they've been undrafted. But that's out of a lot more running backs. Your sample size of players coming after pick 100 is much larger, meaning not only are just 1/3 of the RB1s coming late in drafts, but you're going to have a really tough time choosing which players actually pan out. So the question then becomes, can we exploit this with running backs? If we know draft capital should be factored into how we look at these players, does it even matter? Or to think of it another way, do other fantasy managers seem to care about draft capital? To help answer this question, I looked at myfantasyleague.com's rookie draft data over the last 10 seasons. During this time, we've had a total of 58 different running backs with first-round ADP or top 12 ADP. And the majority of those players were selected in the early parts of the actual NFL draft. But we had guys like Roy Halou, Samaje Perine, Kenneth Dixon, Devontae Booker, Marcus Lattimore. We have backs who were taken in the first round of rookie drafts who were drafted after the third round. We've had almost one of them per season. And of those backs, Devontae Freeman is literally the only one who really became something in fantasy football. Now with this year's draft, we're not running into that problem, partially because it was such a crappy running back class. If we want to use that pick 100 cutoff, we've got Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, Darrell Henderson, David Montgomery, Devin Singletary, and Damian Harris as all viable first-round options. But only Jacobs, Sanders, and Montgomery are being selected in the first round because of their immediate opportunity. But what does that mean for the other three? They all have good draft capital, but they're not being selected in the first round of rookie drafts. Well, over this 10-year span in rookie drafts, we've had 19 running backs selected after the first round who were picked in the top 100. Of those players, Duke Johnson, Jeremy Hill, Lamar Miller, Shane Vereen, David Johnson, Kenyon Drake, and Jerick McKinnon all have given you fantasy-relevant production. That's a hit rate of about 37%. And you could even argue for a couple of other guys on that list. This is why I ranked Devin Singletary in my top 20 despite not really loving Devin Singletary. And this is why I should probably be higher on Damian Harris than I currently am. So there are ways to exploit this system. And I'm sure there are ways to increase your hit rate even more with a little bit of research. That's for running backs though. What about wide receivers? Well, let's quickly run through the same exercise as before where we look at the profiles for top 6 and top 12 wide receivers. Over the last 10 years, we've had 31 unique wide receivers give us at least one high-end wide receiver one season, or a top 6 season. That's pretty close to the running back number of 33. Among those 31 players, 14 of them were drafted in the first round. So almost half of the wide receivers who have given us high-end wide receiver one seasons over the last decade came from the first round. 3 of those players went undrafted. They were Wes Welker, Victor Cruz, and Miles Austin. And then one of them, Josh Gordon, went in the supplemental draft. But he was taken in the second round of that draft, so Cleveland forfeited a second-round pick the following year. And for the record, Adam Thielen was 7th in cumulative scoring at wide receiver this past year, and he was 8th the previous year. And as you know, Adam Thielen went undrafted. Now, outside of Welker, Cruz, and Austin, only 4 players, Brandon Marshall, Brandon Lloyd, Tyreek Hill, and Antonio Brown, were taken outside the top 100. So 24 of the 31 wide receivers in our sample were top 3 round picks. That's 77.4% of the wide receivers. Now let's look at top 12 seasons. Over the last 10 years, we've had 56 different wide receivers give us a top 12 season at the position. Of those players, we've got 2 additional undrafted guys in Doug Baldwin and the aforementioned Adam Thielen. So 5 of the 56 were undrafted, and an additional 9 more came after pick 100. So 14 of the 56 were basically either drafted after the third round or they went undrafted. That's a rate of just 25%. Now, I've done this analysis in the past on my own in slightly different ways, and in the past, I've found that running back draft capital seemed to matter more than wide receiver draft capital. But these numbers all seem the same. But if you've got a first-round running back, chances are he's going to give you fantasy points. I talked about this with Josh Jacobs last week, but basically every first-round running back from the last 10 years has given you at least a season or more than one season of strong fantasy production, as long as they were healthy and as long as they've given you enough time. So we'll have to wait for Rashad Penny. Not all of those backs panned out for years and years, like CJ Spiller, but they don't bust at a very high rate. And my thinking is that it's probably due to the fact that teams will feed their first-round backs given the investment, and volume is everything in fantasy football. Now, over this same 10-year time frame, we've had more than double the amount of wide receiver selections. So the fact that top 6 and top 12 wide receivers share a similar profile to running backs from a draft capital standpoint doesn't tell us that draft capital means the same for both positions. The fact is, wide receivers have a better chance to hit with early round picks because more wide receivers are being selected. I mentioned earlier that over the last 15 drafts, and including 2019, we've had 109 running backs selected in the top 100. At wide receiver, that number is 196. There have been 281 wide receivers being drafted after pick 100 over this 15-year time span. That number is 218 for running back. So let me put this another way so it all makes sense. Wide receivers have been drafted in the top 100 at 1.8 times the rate of running backs over the last 15 seasons. But wide receivers have been drafted after the top 100 at about 1.3 times the rate of running backs. So there's a higher concentration of wide receivers being selected in the first 3 rounds than there are at running back. Since we're seeing similar profiles of top 6 and top 12 backs and wide receivers, that means that early round running backs are panning out at a higher rate than wide receivers. Or in other words, draft capital matters more for running backs. But it still plays a role for wide receivers. We just talked about that. The vast majority of top 6 and top 12 wide receivers are coming from the early rounds of drafts. But again, the question that we should ask is this exploitable? And the answer is probably not as easily as it is at running back. As a fantasy football community, we've been pretty focused on selecting wide receivers in the first rounds of rookie drafts who have good draft capital. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are more wide receivers with day 2 or better draft capital associated with them, so it's easier to fill out the first round with those types of players. Whereas there aren't as many choices at running back, so running back needy teams may need to force things a little bit more. But actually, over the last 10 years, and again, this is according to myfantasyleague.com's rookie ADP data, but over the last 10 years, we haven't selected a wide receiver outside the second round in the first round of rookie drafts. Golden Tate has the lowest draft capital of the 45 wide receivers who have top 12 ADP over the last 10 years. It's actually pretty similar for the second round, too. No wideout has been taken in the second round of rookie drafts with worse draft capital than Kenny Golladay, my boy Babytron. He was selected 96th overall. So I think it's important to factor in draft capital when you're evaluating wide receivers. You don't want to overstate Kelvin Harmon's impact in the NFL because he was ranked highly pre-draft. Don't be stubborn. The chance that a 6th round wide receiver becomes a wide receiver 1 is not very high. But the market does seem to understand this, hence the ADPs that we see. But I think that you can utilize this for redraft purposes as well. Your late round flyers shouldn't be spent on undrafted free agents and late round picks. Utilize draft capital to your advantage there too. Now, last but not least is tight end. Tight end is unlike wide receiver and running back because clearly you're only starting one of them on your fantasy roster. So I'm really only concerned with looking at top 6 tight ends here. We know that we can stream lower end tight end ones. Over the last 10 seasons, we've had 30 different tight ends give us a top 6 tight end season. Among those players, just one of them, Antonio Gates, went undrafted. So right off the bat, we know to probably not give a shit about undrafted tight ends. But 21 of the 30 were drafted in the top 100. So 30% of top 6 tight ends who have given us a high-end tight end 1 season actually had pretty mediocre draft capital. Part of that is because just 76 tight ends have even been drafted in the top 100 over the last 15 years. So really, you could argue that the hit rate for early round tight ends giving you an elite tight end season isn't all that bad, at least compared to running backs and wide receivers. Now, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of first round tight ends in dynasty rookie drafts at all. Over the last 10 years, not including this one, we've had 6 of them. And like wide receiver, we've been pretty good at targeting players who have good draft capital associated with them. So with tight ends, I think the takeaway is that yes, surely draft capital matters in some way, but exploiting that is probably the most difficult of the positions that we've looked at today because there are just so few tight ends being drafted in the first place. So let's just wrap this thing up as nicely as possible. There are so many different ways to talk through draft capital and see how much it actually matters, so please don't walk away from today's podcast thinking that I believe that I have all the answers, or that this was the end all to any sort of draft capital debate. I think what we've seen today, though, is that if you really want a good player in fantasy football, if you want a ceiling for a player, a really good ceiling, you shouldn't be betting on that player being an undrafted free agent. Or really, a player who was drafted day 3 of the draft. Not only do the numbers suggest that earlier round picks produce better fantasy numbers, but they also hit at a much higher rate. It doesn't mean that Philip Lindsay type players will never emerge. It just means that you shouldn't invest anything significant in those types of players before they emerge. We unfortunately can't really exploit the draft capital importance with wide receivers and tight ends very easily, especially at tight end. But I do think that there will be plenty of instances where we'll have these Kelvin Harmon-like debates, where a player a lot of people liked pre-draft falls in the actual draft, and people are still into that player. We saw it to a degree last season with Equanimeous St. Brown. Those players can pan out, but we're playing probability here. they probably won't pan out. Where I think the draft capital topic should really be emphasized is with running backs. Not only do we see a strong hit rate with early round backs as it pertains to fantasy football, but we seem to ignore draft capital more in rookie drafts at that position. And I think the reason we do that is because we look at running back with an immediate gratification lens. What I mean by that is that when we're drafting running backs in rookie drafts, we're often emphasizing landing spot and current situation arguably more than we are at other positions. Now, we should be emphasizing landing spot. Landing spot is important. But when we're overlooking draft capital and focusing too much on landing spot, that's when I think we can get into trouble. Samaje Perine is a prime example of this. Forget how you felt about Perine after he went to Washington in the 4th round of the 2017 draft. One of the big selling points for Perine was, who else is in that backfield? And that type of outlook for a 4th round pick probably isn't smart and sustainable. Like, it's fine to feel that way about a random 4th or 5th rounder. But it's one thing to feel that way, and it's another to then spend a 1st round rookie pick on that player. There will be 4th and 5th round running backs who work out and are successful in fantasy. But if you're looking at probability, you shouldn't be taking those players in the 1st rounds of your rookie draft. And all the while, you shouldn't ignore early round backs who fall in the 2nd round of your rookie drafts either. That's been a low-key money spot for fantasy production over the last decade. Even if those players don't have immediate roles, or even if they don't look like they have immediate roles, that doesn't mean that they'll never emerge. People seem to make that mistake with players like Jeremy Hill or maybe Duke Johnson or even Kenyon Drake. That, I think, is one of the main takeaways here. We know pretty intuitively that draft capital matters. Teams are doing their homework and selecting good players early in their drafts. But I think we lose sight of draft capital when we're making our own team decisions in fantasy football, both in redraft and in Dynasty. And hopefully today's episode serves as a reminder to not forget about what happened on draft day for those players. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. I'm also on Twitter. You can follow me on there at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be in your ears later this week with a mailbag episode.